In this video, I want to explore whether Divinity Original Sin 2 is actually better than Baldur's Gate 3. Now, we know that Baldur's Gate 3 just won Game of the Year award and a handful of other awards at the Game Awards 2023, so this might be a controversial thing to look at, but I want to dive into the nitty-gritty details of these two games and really take a look at why one of them might be better than the other. So first, let's take a look at the things that I think these two games have kind of tied at, meaning that like one isn't really better than the other. And the first one of those is in terms of itemization. You can take a look at the itemization of Divinity Original Sin 2 and see that it has sort of a random itemization to it, meaning like sometimes you get really good stuff when you defeat enemies, sometimes you get really bad stuff. There are some fixed loot locations for like, legendary unique items in that game. But for the most part, the loot is randomized, whereas the loot in Baldur's Gate 3 is basically static throughout, and those are two completely different systems, so you might be wondering why I have them tied here. And I think the reason that one of these systems isn't necessarily better than the other in terms of the way these two games is designed is that the random nature of the itemization in DOS 2 is kind of a double-edged sword. Sometimes it works really well, and you're always excited to see what you get when you defeat an enemy because you never know what it's going to be. But sometimes there's a lot of junk, and sometimes you can have a playthrough where like you just keep getting junk and it's really frustrating. And when you take a look at Baldur's Gate 3 and the loot's always static, some of that excitement, that you're going to have after like a first playthrough about what you're going to get is gone, right? Like the first playthrough, you never know what you're going to get, but subsequent playthroughs, if you're playing multiple times, that excitement about what you're going to get kind of wears off. And a lot of times the loot that you get in Baldur's Gate 3 has no impact on the build that you're playing, or a very, very small impact. Whereas I feel like the loot in DOS 2 has more of an impact on your build. However, in BG3, because it's static, you can really plan your routes and plan your decisions and plan your builds more effectively and execute them more effectively, whereas you don't really know what you're going to get in DOS 2. So sometimes you have to alter your build to match like what you have gear-wise at the moment. So in those ways, I think they're kind of a toss-up. I think you could go either way depending on what your personal preference is, but I don't think one system in terms of itemization is really better than the other. Next one might be kind of controversial is companions. I think the companions in these games are very comparable. Larian does a really good job of creating their companions. They feel like real people in their games. And although I think Baldur's Gate 3 probably did a better job of realizing those companions because you can see them more and see their facial expressions when you have dialogues with them than you could in DOS 2, I think the general development of those companions is pretty comparable in those games. Meaning like if you like the companions in BG3, you probably like them in DOS 2 and vice versa. And I think, there are people out there that think like, oh man, the BG3 companions are so dark and gloomy compared to the DOS 2 companions. So there is some personal preference there. But in my opinion, I think they're developed, to about the same quality. So I think that's kind of a wash. And then the last thing I think these two games are tied on is obviously the art style. The game is made, Baldur's Gate 3 is made in the same engine as Divinity 2, just like an updated version of it. And the graphics are obviously better in Baldur's Gate. But the art style itself is very similar to DOS. And originally, obviously, when we first saw BG3, people thought, oh, that looks just like DOS. And you can see the similarities immediately. If you had never seen or played these games before and someone put one game up on one screen and one game up on the other, you might not be able to tell them the difference. Like they're very similar in terms of their art style. So if you like the art style of one game, you will probably like the art style of the other. Next, let's take a look at the things that Baldur's Gate 3 does better than Divinity Original Sin 2, and the first thing is the tone of the game. Divinity Original Sin 2 has a very whimsical, kind of lighthearted story to it. It is not that the story is an adult story, because it absolutely is, and there are tragic and sad things inside that game, but generally speaking, it has kind of more of a cheeky tone to it, and a lot of people were really hoping for something darker in Baldur's Gate 3, and I think Baldur's Gate 3 managed to accomplish that. There are some really devastating moments in Baldur's Gate 3. I don't want to go into spoilers or anything like that, but there are some absolutely mind-blowingly deep, dark moments in that game that are really going to make you emotional as a character or a player invested in that game, whereas I don't think Divinity Original Sin 2 ever did that. Like it just kind of didn't, because it didn't have that, dark feel to it. So I think Baldur's Gate 3, if you're looking for like a more serious RPG, Baldur's Gate 3 comes out a bit ahead here. And the next thing is the cinematic style or the cutscene style of dialogues in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, both of these games are fully voiced, and that's incredible in its own right, but Baldur's Gate 3 pushes it even further by giving you this sort of cinematic style where like you can see the facial expressions of the character and you can see their tone, whether they get angry or sad at what you're saying. can see their body language. It really immerses you more into the game, makes you feel like you're the one having a conversation rather than like looking above your character that's having a conversation. And I can't understate like how big this point is. If you are someone who's playing a story-driven game like Baldur's Gate and you really want to be immersed into that story, this is one thing that can really, really accomplish that, even though it's so much work to do. And the last thing I want to mention about Baldur's Gate 3 isn't necessarily a better point than Divinity, but it is a point I think you need to make when comparing these games that would help someone make a decision like, okay, if I'm going to get one, which one am I going to get? And that's that Baldur's Gate 3 is the definitive D&D experience on digital format in terms of a video game. There is no better experience for D&D than Baldur's Gate 3 presently. There are, of course, obviously older games that are based off D&D, like Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and there's, Neverwinter Nights and stuff like that. But, if you're just talking about modern video game experience with modern day graphics, etc., Baldur's Gate 3 is basically it. You can go play Pathfinder Kingmaker, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and get a similar D&D experience because Pathfinder is based on D&D. But if you're talking about like what your options are, there are very, very limited options in terms of D&D, and BG3 is the best of the best when it comes to this. So if you want to play a D&D video game, it's BG3. So let's talk about the things that Divinity Original Sin 2 does better, and the first thing is character customization and character progression. And I think predominantly why this is so much better in DOS 2, in my opinion, or not so much better, but better, is that BG3 follows the D&D progression based on the handbook for the most part. There are some deviations where they try to make some improvements and changes, etc. But BG3 is trying to replicate D&D 5th edition in terms of its character progression. And the issue with that is that D&D 5th edition is very streamlined and simplified to make for an easy entry for new players into Dungeons & Dragons. But what happens is, if you're someone who likes complexity and choices and making tough decisions about how your character is going to play and how it's going to feel in combat, a lot of that's been stripped out of 5th edition D&D. And in fact, when you play on the easier difficulty of Baldur's Gate 3, you can't even multi-class in the game. So you basically just take the same level all the way up. And there are very few decisions to be made when you level up in Baldur's Gate 3 or D&D 5th edition. Generally, like every 4th level, you pick a feat most of the time if you're, just making a single class character. Or if you're making a spellcaster, you'll pick some spells depending on which spellcaster you are. As some spellcasters, you just get access to all the spells. So there aren't a ton of choices to be made there. So it doesn't give you like this sense of like making tough decisions about your character customization and character progression. Whereas in Divinity Original Sin 2, you can basically do whatever you want. You could level up like one in each skill school. Like you could go all over the place. You can combine warfare with hunter or huntsman. You can combine pyromancy with water spells. Like there is just complete freedom to make whatever you want. And I think it's a better system for someone who likes to kind of think outside the box and to make a character that's just exactly how they want to make it, even if it's like a silly concept. And you'll even notice like on this YouTube channel that I have made tons of builds for DOS 2 because of the amount of freedom there is. And even though we've done tons of BG3 content, arguably more BG3 content than we did DOS 2 content on this channel, we've done very few actual build guides, and the reason for that is because a lot of the guides we did for this game were just kind of explaining the class mechanics and how they worked and their interactions, etc. Because if you understand how a class works, then you basically understand how your build works. Like most of the time, you're like one or two classes for the most part. And once you understand those mechanics, then you don't really need me to tell you how to make a build. And the next thing I want to talk about for DOS 2 that I like better, I think is better, is combat. The combat in DOS 2 is absolutely phenomenal. It's arguably the best turn-based combat I've ever played, although I really do like Pillars of Eternity 2's combat in turn-based as well. But DOS 2's is, because of the elemental interactions that are in the game, the way you can create these synergies, it's absolutely fantastic. And no one had ever done this really before Divinity Original Sin and Divinity Original Sin 2. So it's something that's absolutely fun. And when you first get into these games, you're like, whoa, there's a lot to this. And really mastering those elemental interactions and how they, come together to create builds and party synergy is absolutely fantastic. And admittedly, Baldur's Gate 3's combat now is so much better than it was when Early Access first started several years ago. It's in a much, much better place, and I do really like Baldur's Gate 3's combat, but for some reason, in Baldur's Gate 3, it's like I wasn't as excited about getting into combat as I was in DOS 2, and that's not to say I didn't enjoy it, but in DOS 2, I was like always looking forward to getting into combat to see what I could do. It was like a puzzle I had to figure out, and in BG3, it's not quite so much that way, And I think a lot of that is tied to the character customization and progression because of the way the loot system is, because of the fact that, you know, when you level up, you're usually just clicking a level up button and stuff's getting added to you automatically. Whereas in DOS 2, like, you might get random loot, so you didn't know what you're going to get from the battle. You would also, you know, level up, and then you'd have to make a tough decision about where you want to spend your attribute points or where you want to get a talent, etc. So I think those things all factor together to make a better combat experience. And then the last point is kind of a point that probably won't affect most players, but it's the fact that Divinity Original Sin 2 had like a Dungeon Master mode where you could kind of like create a campaign and put players through it where someone's like pitting against you, etc. And this is something that Baldur's Gate 3 should really have, and I can remember talking to Larian about this a few times, and it seemed like, reading through the lines and the conversations that I had with them, that Wizards of the Coast really didn't want that to be in the game. I think there's something going on with that company, maybe, in terms of licensing, and, you know, I know that a while back, like D&D, like they were trying to monetize people's modules that they were creating, and I think there was something like that going on. I didn't really get a clear answer from Larian about this, but I kind of got the sense that Wizards really didn't want it because they couldn't monetize it. That's kind of the sense that I got. So I don't think Baldur's Gate 3 is going to have a DM mode unless it's like maybe monetized. And that's really a shame. It's like not a huge thing that I think like 5 to 10% of players would probably use this feature, but they're the players that will keep playing these games over time. And, you know, every so often someone makes like a really cool mod or feature or module, etc. And by having that, sometimes it can pull players back into the game. So I think it's kind of a shame that Baldur's Gate 3 does not have that. So all in all, I think what it really boils down to, whether DOS 2 is better than BG3, is, are you more focused as a player on the combat and character customization and character progression? Are those more important to you? Or is the storytelling, the style of storytelling, more important to you? Like, that's really it. And I think those are a personal preference. For me, I'm always a gameplay person first. Like, story is second to me to gameplay. Like, if a game has great gameplay and the story is shit, I still prefer that most of the time over a game that has a phenomenal story but the gameplay is shit. It's not always true, but generally for me, that's the way it is. So I think for me, Divinity Original Sin 2 is the better of the two games because it just excels in those areas. Now, if we're talking about Divinity Original Sin 3 and they manage to add that darker tone, even if they don't add the darker tone, I kind of like the cheeky tone of DOS. But if they add the cutscene style cinematics and storytelling that they've kind of learned and improved from Baldur's Gate 3 to DOS 3, keeping those same combat mechanics, character customization they have that I love from DOS 2, it'll probably be my favorite RPG of all time. So anyway, that's what I think. What do you guys think? Do you guys like BG3 more than DOS 2? Have you played DOS 2 yet? If you haven't, you really should. Let me know in the comments below.